Okay, so both of you have ministries. You've got Preaching Peace, and Martin, you're pastoring a church at Gateway in Edmonton, but you also have your blog, martintrench.com, and you're both challenging certain paradigms that people have. And I want to ask, kind of just have a little bit of a round conversation talking about this idea of paradigms, and both your opinions, how our paradigms inform us, or how they aid us, and also how they hinder us. So there's that information, but there's also the aiding and the hindering. So anybody can jump in.
Well, we're all embedded in paradigms. I mean, this is something that Hollywood has been seeing for some time with movies like The Matrix and The Terminator and these kinds of things. We live with presuppositions or worldviews that we're not even aware of are there. They inform the structure of our thinking. And some of these worldviews come from ancient Greek philosophy, some come from Roman law, some come from medieval Christendom, some come from Hollywood, some come from parents and teachers, all combined to create these this internal set of presuppositions. That's the reality of the paradigm. Mm-hmm. If the presuppositions are incorrect, if I say, for example, that science is evil, the Bible's absolute truth, and the Bible's historically and perfectly accurate, and therefore I can't believe anything science says about creation, I'm going to do a 6-day, creationist thing. It's not that the Bible says that, it's that my paradigm requires it. And so that's why we need paradigm changes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I remember, for instance, years ago, like, this is one of these paradigms that has swung to the opposite extreme and needs to come back. But I remember years ago, at the early days of like the Vineyard movement, when John Wimber used to put on big seminars, he always did the first day on worldviews. Mm. Because his experience in the evangelical church was that the evangelical church had this worldview that locked God outside of experience, yeah, or drew a line between the supernatural and the natural, mm-hmm, or the spiritual world and the material world. Mm-hmm. Drew a line between it. And before he would ever teach on healing or anything else, mm-hmm, he would have, because he realized that you could teach on a subject, and people could agree mentally with all of the concepts on the subject that you're teaching about. But if their worldview, because people hold contradictory beliefs at the same time, yeah, if their worldview, their subconscious worldview still contradicts this new belief, then they're never. So, and it's the same with any discipline. I think that you can teach. I think when people understand facts, but they aren't able to put them into practice in their life, it's because the worldview they hold is one in which those facts don't work, mm-hmm, even if they consciously agree, no, those facts are true. So I suppose an example of that would be, of the whole worldview idea, would be the fact that it's like a map. The map is not the territory idea.
That's right.
So, like when sailors were making maps to begin with, the maps weren't very good. Yeah. But by trial and error, they would realize every time I sail here, I crash into rocks. Maybe we should change the map. Maybe the map isn't quite right. And worldviews are simply our internal map. We've been told, or it's been drawn on our subconscious mind, this is what the world is like. But we keep banging into things. It doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. This is what God is like. But it doesn't feel that way. This is what the Bible is like. But we're reading it, and there's things that don't fit in. And so all we're doing by changing our worldview is we're not changing the world. The world is the way it is. God is the way he is. Mm-hmm. But we have limited our ability to understand God and his creation by our worldview. And so we need to just keep redrawing the map.
And part of the reality we're dealing with in the evangelical tradition is that they want to buy into an absolute worldview. So they want to say their worldview itself is divinely inspired. And if there's one thing we know from modern science, it's that knowledge creates new possibilities for new tests that create new hypotheses that generate new theories. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, think about it. In 500 years, we've gone from Ptolemy to Copernicus to Einstein to Heisenberg. I mean, there's huge paradigm changes all along the way. Same in the disciplines of psychology, literary theory, philosophy, but also theology. The way we understand God is, we're finally recognized, we've been locked into a paradigm. Comes mm-hmm. to us from the early church, comes to us from the influence of Augustine, the role that Constantine plays, comes through the influence of medieval scholasticism, comes through the influence of the reformers, comes through the influence of people like Wesley and the Pietists and the Revivalists. I mean, there are all these filters, grids, and maps that kind of get laid on top of each other, and by the time they get to us, all those filters, grids, and maps we think are the absolute truth. And so that's what we're taught to believe.
Yeah.
And there's a real need for that now to shift.
So when we're talking about, let's just take truth as a broad topic, not inside of any type of particular field or bubble, be it the church or anything, but as a human being, we're already talking about this idea of paradigms, looking at shifting paradigms. What do you think in your journeys of discussing with people, your own journeys, being, you're dealing with a lot of people definitely inside the church, but also in the academic world, and obviously as a pastor, you're dealing much more with the common, person just that hasn't maybe done a lot of these research and things like that. So especially for a person who's just like, oh my goodness, like, what do you mean my paradigm can be shifted or my paradigm can be changed? Looking at this idea, how does a person become more honest or maybe possibly more forensic in digging into this idea of truth and looking at some of these layers, understanding how history goes? Like, when a person's like, where do I start? What does that look like? How do I become more honest? How do I do that?
I think starting with the last thing Michael just said there about, I don't know who the first person to say this was, but there's a saying that the first step to enlightenment is awareness. It's kind of like an Alcoholics Anonymous. You have to admit you're an alcoholic before you can be treated.
Yeah.
You have to admit that there's a problem. Your eyes have to be open. So most of us are hypnotized.
Yeah.
We're asleep. And it's when someone wakes us up and says, everything you're claiming to believe in absolute truth, but what you're believing is this interpretation of absolute truth, and that one on top of it, and that one on top of it, and all of these filters. I think when people begin to realize my beliefs, I claim that my beliefs are based on A or B or C, they're based on the Bible or they're based on whatever they claim they're based on. But they realize my beliefs are actually based on a whole bunch of preconceived ideas, presuppositions that I hold and subconsciously and carry about with me all the time. And when I read the Bible, when I sit in church, when I go to work, when I turn the radio on, I am filtering everything through my preconceived ideas. I think when people realize that realization alone is the first step to there may be absolute truth out there, but I am not understanding it absolutely.
That's right. For me as a theologian, I'm going to start with two texts. The first text comes from Ephesians, the truth as it is in Jesus. Or the saying in the Gospel of John chapter 14 where Jesus says, I am the living and truthful way, truthful path. So for me, just within the framework of the church, or even the writing that I do for scholars, I'm still focused on Jesus as this ultimate truth, this reality. Jesus is my base point. So that for me means that I need to learn not just as much as I can about Jesus, but about the context in which he's embedded, what his worldviews. And so I can go and discover all the various worldviews of the different groups of his time and the cultures and the things that happened before that influenced all that. By understanding all of that, then I can see Jesus much more clearly, particularly where he's engaging his cultural tradition positively, but also where he's engaging it critically. And then that becomes a model for me in my time to ask, okay, where are the areas I also need to engage my religious culture critically like Jesus did his, and where are the ways I can affirm that culture at the same time? So that even in a paradigm change, one never throws the baby out with the bathwater. And this is a mistake that's been happening for about 25 years in progressive Christianity and the emergent church. They want to throw institutional Christianity out with this new model. They want to do away with 2,000 years of thinking as though that somehow has not helped even to birth them. Real paradigm changes take the old information, the old paradigms, and in a sense, put them right at the heart of the next system. But now, because of the new way of thinking, that old model is also transformed. So, for example, Einstein's general theory of relativity has Newton's absolute geometrics right at the center, and yet Einstein is able to show how this now all becomes relative. So you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater ever when you're doing a paradigm change. You're able to incorporate it, explain it, and move beyond it.
Yeah, a good illustration of that's where Jesus said, therefore, any teacher of the law who becomes a disciple of the kingdom now can bring things old and new out of his treasures.
That's right.
So it's not really, you know, sometimes we may say, you know, that the old covenant, Jesus did away with it or whatever, but it's not so much that it's done away with as it's transformed and elevated into what it should God always intended. Yeah.
So let me ask, I mean, for myself, I think, you know, like you said, we've all been on a journey. My big thing when you're looking at my own paradigm shift was, I think, moving away from that sense of like clinging to a certain paradigm. And I was challenged, I was going through this journey, and there was this one phrase that really, I think, was like this switch for me. And it's something that kind of is the vision, the bedrock of a Bold Cup of Coffee, and started this conversation with different writers, things that it was confidence, not certainty.
That's right.
And so it's this idea of like, we're looking at the sense of we want, because I think for both of you, you're not looking at the sense of saying, you know, relativity in the sense of you can't know anything. Don't have confidence in anything. You're right. that shifting of the waves, but there's this sense of like, we want you to have deep convictions. We want you to be able to wrestle. We want you to be able to challenge with people. We want you to have confidence in your faith, but not to come to a place of utter certainty. Now, you said something in another interview, I think, you said people want to have assurance, right? They want to have assurance in their faith, but don't want to come that with like a battering ram of certainty. If you don't believe what I believe, then...
Same thing, confidence, assurance. So for me, I have tremendous confidence in the theological stuff I've worked out. That doesn't mean it isn't full of errors and gaps. I just can't see it. So the next generation will come after me. They'll see those things, they'll correct them, and they will produce a better theology than that which I've done. Just as my theology, I think, is a little bit better than the shoulders of the great giants I'm standing on, like Bart and others. So it really is recognizing, okay, if my theological thinking is even better than my mentors, I have to give room for the theological thinking of the next generation to be better than mine. Yeah. And to be open to that.
Yeah. That reminds me of, you know, that there's some people that will only use the King James version of the Bible, you know, and won't use any other version. Although the interesting thing is, in the translator's foreword, they say that they hope that other people will come after them and will improve upon their translation, you know. But some people want to hold to that translation, even though the translators themselves wanted future people to improve upon it. The same with their theologies. A good theologian should want future generations to improve upon their theologies, not insist, no matter how much our knowledge increases, you must never change this view. You know?
And it's interesting to say that too, like this idea of like building upon each other. I think it's interesting, something that Brad Jerzak said in a seminar where he's talking about that he knows that the church, as a universal church, you know, won't go into this great heresy because we counterbalance ourselves. We have people, yes, maybe on extremes, but it's when we isolate ourselves, right? So I guess the question in that framework of understanding that idea of like, as a community, how important in your minds is dialogue? How important is dialogue now with each other, but also, like as he says, we build each other? Where, like, how crucial is that idea of conversation? Because I mean, that for us at Bold Cup, that's the whole idea. Is like we want to dialogue, we want to challenge. So where does dialogue? How do we do that? I guess healthily, but also how does that actually move us forward?
For me, I think that one of the reasons why there is like disunity and very often infighting in the Christian church is because people, rather than dialoguing, only listen to their own camp. And it's reinforced in them again and again. This is true, they're wrong, this is true, they're wrong, over and over again. And so when Christians think that other Christians are heretics or into false teaching and so on, probably 90% of the occasions people I've ever come across like that, they don't actually understand the other person's view, and they'll say things like, well, that person obviously doesn't believe the Bible, you know, or whatever. But the other person could be an absolute inerrantist with the Bible and may have come to their view because they believe the Bible teaches it. Yeah. You know what I mean? Not because they disregard the Bible. And so I think dialogue enables people to realize, oh, right, I don't hold to your view on that, but now I understand why you hold it. Right. And although I'm not totally convinced by all the evidence you're presenting, there is quite a lot of evidence there, and so I don't feel comfortable just dismissing it like I used to anymore, you know? So now I'm going to have to include you in the family.
Or at least wrestle with. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the fascinating thing then about dialogue is, who are we dialoguing with? So as Martin said, if you're only having these conversations in camp, one of the things you'll never learn is the beauty of the Christian tradition. So Protestants need to read Catholics. Catholics need to read Protestants and Anabaptists. Anabaptists need to read Orthodox. We really need to be reading in all of these incredible streams. And so one of the things that when I'm talking to young pastors and they go, where should I read? I say everywhere.
Yeah.
You should be reading early church history. You should be reading antiquity. You should be reading medieval mysticism and scholasticism. You should be reading Reformation thought. You should be reading modern thought. You should be reading as much as you can everywhere you can. When I was first in Bible college, Bernie Ram gave this lecture to us. This is back in the day before anybody knew the internet would exist, but he insisted we build libraries because we'd never know where we'd end up. And so we had this lecture on how to build a library, and so mine is 3 basic parts: Bible, church history, and theology. But one thing he said to us is we needed to pick a thinker a year and read everything we could that year that thinker wrote. So I know 1 year I did Calvin, 1 year I did Luther, 1 year Moltmann, Pannenberg, Ricoeur, Kierkegaard, Ellul. I've been reading Barth for 38 years, Bonhoeffer the same. I mean, so I'll pick a thinker a year and I'll read everything I can. And I would think that's an important discipline. And one of the reasons it's important is our tendency is to shut down dialogue, is to read one small piece somebody wrote, label them, stick them in a box and be done with them, rather than reading really broadly. So in their work, so for me, Calvin, for example, I've been reading Calvin since I was 19 years old. And I'm a fierce critic of a lot of Calvin and Calvinism especially. But I love Calvin. I read Calvin all the time. I dip into the commentaries. I want to know what Calvin is saying. Yeah. There's some things, that Calvin says that nobody's ever said better. So nobody's 100% right. Nobody's 100% wrong. Everybody's worth reading, at least a little bit of,
See, what I'm loving about this dialogue too is that I'm hearing much more pastoral and much more academic. What's great is seeing this think of when you're having a coffee with somebody who thinks differently than you, to listen and dialogue, but also at the same time to look at the time that you have, but also to dig deep into the richness of different traditions, and also looking at the broadness and the beauty of the mosaic God is working. I mean, even just to leave Western world and go into the East or go into Asia and things like that, how the church looks drastically different, right? So I think it really just helps to understand that, to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, as James says, right? That's the first thing. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right?